Thank you, Raphael, for inviting me to do this. I've spoken about what I do a lot in various environments, but to do it, this is unique, and it's really interesting to sort of talk about feminism after a play like this. I have to admit, feels a bit intimidating. So, thank you for nodding while I look at you. And two comments that I just had just after the production. One was the sort of attitude about anger in relationship to feminism, which is there's a long conversation about in the history of feminism, obviously, and so that's an interesting thing for me to maybe touch on in a minute. And the other point that Raphael just made was that this made him think about Judy Chicago's The Dinner Party. I don't know if any of you have ever seen Judy Chicago's The Dinner Party, which is housed in the Sackler Center for Feminist Art at the Brooklyn Museum, where I work. My title is Sackler Family Curator of the Sackler Center for Feminist Art. And The Dinner Party, for those of you who know it, is a work of art that was made and completed in 1978. It took the work and labor of a number of people. What was the brainchild of Judy Chicago, very much the product of second wave feminists, one of the icons of second wave feminism, as we call it, the feminism that emerged in the late 1960s and 1970s to sort of describe what I still think we still think of as feminism today. It's still sort of the roots that many of us consider it as. And The Dinner Party is kind of the center of the center at the Sackler Center. It is a work of art that was designed to reintroduce back into the history that Judy Chicago learned, which was a very Western, very Eurocentric, very Judeo-Christian history, to reintroduce women figures into that history. So she and her cohorts came up with a total of 1,038 names that they reintroduced to history. And that's still very much a part of what we do at the Sackler Center, to think about the history, because one of the things that the second wave feminists did was start something that is still something that I do every day and is part of my job, and that's called revisionist history. Rewriting history so that it includes people that were written out of it, it includes stories that were written out of it, it includes approaches to life that were written out of it. And that's very much, I think, the core of what we do at the Sackler Center. And there's two things I always say about my job at the Sackler Center. The first is I'm really glad it's the Sackler Center for Feminist Art, and really glad it's not the Sackler Center for Women's Art. I feel like that is a term and that is a concept that is not so interesting to me. The idea of feminism, thinking about feminism as a methodology, which this play very much does, thinking about feminism as a way of understanding the world, a way of looking at the world, is vitally important to me. It is not so important to me to think about, in this day of gender fluidity and breaking down of binaries, to think about a space for women, per se. I think that that's something we very much talk about and think about the difference between. The other thing I say that I'm really glad about is that the Sackler Center is housed in the Brooklyn Museum. The Brooklyn Museum is a standard Western model of collecting history, collecting all of time and presenting it in one place. It's a model that's problematic, but it's a model that's really important to me. It's a model that speaks to me, but it also is a place that allows the Sackler Center to flourish in a completely different way. It's a place that allows me as a curator to look at everything in that space, in that building, and think about it differently, and that's my primary job. I always say that it's not my job to convince anybody to be a feminist. It's not my job to add words to the end of feminism or to qualifiers to make people feel comfortable with it. My job is to show that if you're alive in 2016 and you're looking at visual culture, you've been impacted by feminism. The way you look at things has been impacted by one of the most important political, social, cultural movements of the last 50 years. And that's incredibly moving to me and incredibly important. And just to sort of touch on that, I want to just really briefly mention 3 shows that I've worked on. One that happened last year, one that's up right now, and one that's coming up next year, just to give you an idea of what that means. And the first one is an example of one of the ways that I think we can think really expansively about what feminism means. And it's a show that was a monographic exhibition by on the work of a woman named Judith Scott, a woman who never once in her life uttered the word feminist, a woman who never thought about feminism, a woman who never had the opportunity to think about feminism because she was an artist who was born with Down syndrome. She was largely deaf and mute. She was institutionalized for more than 35 years and had virtually no access to the ability to make anything. She was given an important gift in that her twin sister gained guardianship of her and brought her to a place in Oakland, California called Creative Growth, where she had the opportunity to work amongst and with other artists. And in that process, after 2 years of doing nothing in Creative Growth, she started making art. She made art for about 15 years. She had a process where she would make an object. These objects were wrapped fibers, sculptures that were things she found, that she stole, that she sort of grabbed from other people, and she made these amazing sculptural objects that I fell in love with without knowing her story. They speak to art that we understand as art because of feminism. Feminism, one of the things that allows us to do is to see things that 40, 50 years ago we wouldn't have even understood as art. Things made with natural fibers, things made in kind of an ad hoc way, things that are considered decorative, things that are considered minor. But most importantly, for me, the radicality, to go back to that, the revolutionary aspect of the Sackler Center for Feminist Art doing an exhibition of Judah Scott's work is that Judah Scott could become an artist because of the work of feminism, because of the work of the civil rights movement, the gay rights movement, the feminist movement in the 1960s and 1970s. An artist like Judah Scott had the opportunity to come to a place like Creative Growth, which was founded on the principles of the disability rights movement, where she then produced work. She never told us anything about the work. She never even actually acknowledged the work when she had made the work. She never told us which way was up. She never told us how to hang it. She never told us if she liked it. She didn't tell us if it was art. She didn't care what we thought of it, but it's incredible. And it's moving, and it participates in an incredible dialogue in the history of art, and it changes the way other art looks. And so for me, as a curator of feminist art, to bring those kinds of objects into the Brooklyn Museum and completely change the dialogue about who gets to make art and how we get to contextualize it is very important. So that's one aspect of feminist curating that is very powerful. The other one is completely different. If that's a story or a narrative that's about sort of crafting something from a real place of not knowing. Right now we have an exhibition up that's all about knowing, and it's all about collaboration. It's an exhibition called Agitprop. Agitprop, as many of you know, is a term that grew out of the Russian Revolution. It's a combination of the terms agitation and propaganda. And I have always had this feeling in the Brooklyn Museum, inspired by the Brooklyn Museum and our collections, that if you looked at any point in history, at any time, in any place, you could probably find an artist who was making something because they wanted to change someone else's mind. Because they wanted to take a political position and they wanted to have a conversation about that position. And thinking about that, we decided to develop an exhibition on the history of Agitprop. Not so much on the history of Agitprop, on the notion of Agitprop and how it plays out. But because we are the Brooklyn Museum, because we have this historical collection, we decided to do it by including history and by including multiple voices. This is where the radicality of this show comes from. Agitprop is a political impulse, it's a social impulse, it's a collaborative impulse oftentimes, and it is an impulse that's about fostering political action outside of museum walls. And so thinking about all those things, I invited the entire staff of the Sackler Center. There were 4 of us at the time, and we all co-curated the exhibition. We came up with 5 historical examples of Agitprop, Soviet-era Agitprop, Tina Modati's socialist photographs from Mexico, the suffrage movement in the United States, the FSA Theater Project that supported Roosevelt's New Deal, particularly in terms of farming and farm administration, and the NAACP's anti-lynching campaign, a cultural campaign to change people's minds about lynching in this country. So those were 5 historical sort of case studies that we developed about Agitprop, this group of the 4 of us. And then, in a really radical gesture for curators, we invited 20 artists who we think are really excellent thinkers about Agitprop, contemporary artists, to add to the show. So we opened the show with 5 historical examples of Agitprop and the work of 20 artists and collaborative, often collaborative groups to participate. Then, in an example of relinquishing control, which is hard for curators to do, we invited those 20 artists to invite another group of artists. So we had 20 more artists in the show that we put up 6 weeks later. Then we invited those 20 artists to invite another group. So we had 3 waves of additions to this exhibition, which was really intentional in the sense of, so we ended up with over 60 artists, over 40 collaborative groups covering 105 years of history, encompassing, I think, around 23 countries. So this is a big show, and it's a show that folds out over time, and it's a show that, this is the most radical thing about it to me, it's a show that has over 40 curators. Because each of these people that added somebody to this exhibition, each group, contributed to the making of the show and has made it what it looks like now. I invite you all to come out and see it. It's up until July 10th. And it is an experiment. You know, one of the things we talk about in the Brooklyn Museum a lot, or in museums a lot, is what does success look like when you do an exhibition? Who's the audience for the show? What are the goals of the show? What do you want to come out of it? And for me, I have to say, one of the most interesting things about this show is that success doesn't necessarily look like a cohesive show in this case. The poor designer who had to work on getting all these pieces in there. But what success looks like is building a model. And I think that's one of the revolutionary aspects of this. Success looks like building a model in which you can have multiple voices, multiple communities, multiple conversations at the same time. And you can invite all of those conversations into one room and think about how you can develop models for making exhibitions that are not driven solely by one person, not driven solely by one sort of brilliant thinker, but rather by a real community-oriented drive to want to examine something. In this case, examining how politics functions when it's driven by an artist, but its intention is outside the art world. Its intention is to talk to people in the streets. Its intention is to bring other people into a conversation about a political agenda. And the works are extraordinary, and they range from, as I said, the historical works. They also range in the contemporary works from some of you may remember a couple of years ago in Fort Greene Park, the bust of Edward Snowden that went up as a guerrilla action in the middle of the night onto the Prison Ship Martyrs Monument. So we have that work of art in the exhibition, an excellent example of agitprop. We have a great sculpture by a wonderful artist named Andrea Bowers, which is a tree sitting platform. She is an activist and has done tree sitting to save old growth forests in California, and she's built sculptures that reflect that and actually are tree sitting platforms and contain all the things that you need when you're sitting in a tree for a long time, and sort of playing with the idea of sculpture in relationship to that. There's a great work by an artist named Jalili Atiku from Nigeria, who has made himself into a one-man kind of marching protest with these incredible posters that he wraps himself in, and they project from him, and it's this very striking presence in the streets of Nairobi, which is a very serious and dangerous position for him to put himself in. And it's a very moving work in which he walks through the streets with all these signs, like this one-man band, and people start to follow him and sort of become part of this spontaneous protest, which is a sort of remarkable work of art, and remarkable example of a work of art literally turning into an activation device for other people. The last show I just want to mention is coming up next year, and it sort of is another example of one of the ways that we can think actively about curating differently and curating maybe radically. And it's a show called We Wanted a Revolution, Black Radical Women, 1965 to 1985. And it's a really important show. It's a really important show for the Sackler Center, but it's a really important show for the world. The reason it's important for the Brooklyn Museum and the Sackler Center is that if the Sackler Center is born of this moment of feminism in the 1960s, as represented by Judy Chicago's iconic work. One of the things that's really important for us to do on our 10th anniversary is not only to celebrate that history, but also to think about how a place like a Center for Feminist Art can function in the future. What should it look like? What kind of positions does it have to grapple with? What kind of priorities do future generations have for the viability of feminism? And one of the things we can also do is acknowledge the way that feminism didn't work for a lot of people, particularly communities of color, and in this case, African American women, who were often not comfortable with the agenda of second wave feminism as it was largely written by middle-class white women. And this was a known fact, and it was a known and discussed thing, but nobody's ever done an exhibition that sort of tries to address that and address the multiple feminisms that need to exist in the world in order for feminism to be a viable force for change. I just want to close by, quoting, since we're in a theater, a great line from Lorraine Hansberry, the writer of Erase It in the Sun. She was interviewed by Studs Terkel in 1959, and she said that that in any oppressed group, the women tend to be twice oppressed, and those who are twice oppressed can often become twice militant. And this is an idea that I think plays very much in the exhibition that I'm working on. And then the last quote comes from a great artist named Emily Roysden, who is a member of a group called LTTR, an excellent group that stands for Lesbians to the Rescue. And Emily, in talking about what I sort of started this talk with, that idea of feminism as protest and what has it become, what does it need to become, she famously said that we're not just protesting what we don't want, we are also performing what we want. And I think that's an important way of thinking about feminist activism as it can be and is being developed, I think, by multiple generations and multiple types of feminists in the world right now. So, enough out of me. Thank you.
What does the conversation look like when you're discussing the idea of a woman or feminist hall in a museum in the future? I feel like when I've been to a lot of museums, I feel like when I walk into a hall like that, I feel like I'm already judging because it's called the women's area, the women's hall of women's art, and I don't believe that it should be categorized as women's art because it's art, and everybody should be considered to be the same. So when time does that change in the future, and whether, I see like now there's articles about sororities and how feminists used to say that's not the way to go, that's sort of the collective, I guess basic people's way to do it, and now it's sort of changing. And will it change? That conversation, what does that look like?
No, it's a complicated question, and it's exactly speaks to why, when I first started talking, I think the idea of a women's center is a very different thing than a feminist center. First of all, we have shown in our exhibition right now, feminism is not specific. It's specific to women to some degree, but it's not specific to women in another way. It's specific to everybody. And we have done many exhibitions with male artists, with men who identify as feminist, with people who identify as not being male or female, but still identify with the imperatives that feminism presents in terms of parity, in terms of idea of equity. Most people, I think, these days would feel like, or most people in the worlds in which I work, think of feminism as the most important sort of humanist movement. So while it's grounded in the very true and still prevalent reality that women do not have gender equity or do not have equity with men in most things, the reality is that what that means in different communities, in different cultures, is different. To your question about, what one of the things that makes me think about is, Georgia O'Keeffe is the last plate on Judy Chicago's The Dinner Party. She sort of ends the 33 places at the dinner table. And I think about it every time I walk by her place setting and I talk to her, or I don't talk to her. I should talk to her when I talk about her. She famously was not interested in feminism. Gloria Steinem apparently made a pilgrimage to Ghost Ranch to meet Georgia O'Keeffe, and she wouldn't see her. And she always said she wanted to be a woman, she wanted to be an artist. And that's, I think, most people feel that way. She wanted to be the best artist. And that's true. And most artists would say that. But the fact of the matter is, she also has become a part of the dialogue, and she has become identifiable as a role model, as an icon, as somebody who people look up to, as a fascinating character. And the conversation about feminism around her is very important. Alfred Stieglitz, when he first saw Georgia O'Keeffe's drawings, he famously said, "Oh, finally, a woman on paper." So she dealt her whole life with this idea of her gender and struggled with it against odds that I think are even unbelievable, unknowable today. Yet she rejected that title. Yet her life was folded into this burgeoning reality. And so she is there on the dinner party because she doesn't get to write history. She has a place in it. But I think it's really important to also understand that it's complex and that parallel paths for different ideational politics, for different kinds of politics that relate to personal characteristics, are always toggling, I think, between the need for specificity and the need to talk in larger terms. And that's an ongoing conversation. You had a question?
I was just wondering if, from your perspective, you see a growth in the sort of percentage, if you will, of agitprop work versus, I don't know what the other would be, but.
I'm sorry?
Do you think there's more socially conscious or agitprop work going on now?
I think artists have always made political work, as I said. I think that the politics that shows up in art changes. I think since the 1960s, there has been a very strong current in art making that is really concerned with understanding how politics functions in the visual arts. I think that most of us who took an art history 101 class as undergrads or whatever, and you sort of learn a narrative about, say, abstract expressionism, and you learn a narrative about modernism and impressionism and the sort of Western history that abstraction and that sort of individual genius sort of all revolves around. I think since the 1960s, artists have struggled really hard and fought really hard to, and very successfully to push back on that idea. So I think some of the best work, always acknowledges politics. And different artists do that in different ways, and different artists prioritize it more than other. But I think that a self-consciousness about the context in which you're making something requires politics. And I can't think of an example where it doesn't. Otherwise, you're denying it. As I said, it varies in terms of degrees, but I think it's always there, and it can always be discussed. And that, as I thank you for the sort of segue, is very much what I spend my time thinking about. For example, Judah Scott, an artist who makes purely abstract sculptures and had no engagement with politics. There's still a way in which, for us to understand how she made what she made, I don't think we'll ever understand why she made what she made. The context in which she made what she made is really important and adds a lot to understanding her work and appreciating it. And that's about politics. Yeah? Sorry.
I love the way that you described the sort of viral way that you curated the agitprop show with the artist that you'd chosen, choosing another. And so from the way that you've described what the Brooklyn Museum is, and that it has this kind of, colonial and capitalist style of let me just purchase a work and then hold it, or steal a work and hold it, right? So given that history, what are the sort of feminist methods that you have of curating, I guess? And also, part of another sort of side note on that is, since there's so much more body-based and performance work coming into museums now, how are those owned or purchased?
Well, there's a couple questions there. The first one in regards to how you sort of talk about historical work or other kinds of work that isn't necessarily overtly feminist, but how you talk about it from a feminist perspective. One of the examples that I can think of is, one of the things we think about in the Brooklyn Museum is a wall label. You can take a label that we spend a lot of time thinking about wall labels, believe me, 75 words, and the amount of time and the number of people that participate in writing them is kind of crazy. But it's really important to realize that how the subjectivity shifts. So if we take a work by an artist named Elizabeth Catlett, you can write one label that's about the formal values, the influences, the kind of standard reading of that work of art. You can write another wall label in which you talk about her identity as a woman. You could write another wall label in which you talk about her identity as an African American woman. You could write another label in which you talk about her identity as a woman with of Native American descent as well. Those are all identities that she attached to herself during her lifetime. So each of those is an example of a different approach. And I think that self-consciousness about those kinds of things is really important. And in the Brooklyn Museum, when you have 130 years of institutional history around those things as well, it's really interesting. And the Brooklyn Museum is unique. Every museum is unique, but the Brooklyn Museum's relationship to its own place in communities is sort of unique. It has always been very engaged in thinking about how to make people feel comfortable coming into the place. I don't know if any of you have been to the Brooklyn Museum. There's a facade that has a sort of grated glass structure in the front of it, which a lot of people hate. It's this sort of contemporary addition to this sort of neoclassical structure. That the museum was built at the same era and the same architects and the same sort of model as the Metropolitan. And like the Metropolitan, when the Brooklyn Museum was built, it had one of those grand staircases. It actually had a much bigger staircase than the Metropolitan has now. In the 1930s, one of our directors, in one of the first attempts to really kind of think about what will make this place welcoming to the people right outside our doors, who are the people that are not coming in, he took the stairs off. So they were just sheared off the front and taken away. So then about 12 years ago, when we were working on, before my time, working on the facade and making an addition, that addition, if you notice it and you go by now, actually reflects the original staircase that had been in place. So that's a literal example of a physical manifestation of the way in which museum directors and museum curators think about the message they're sending and how they can engage with people differently. The question about how you, I believe, about how you collect body-based work or video work and that sort of thing is an enormous subject that all museums are dealing with and grappling with. One of the things that artists do for a living is think of ways to challenge curators and museums in terms of how they can maintain the care and feeding of objects. And it's an enormous proposition. And the people in the museum, I can tell you this, it's being recorded, the people with the most power in the museum are the conservators. They're the ones who tell you how long you can keep something out, or how long you can show something, or where it has to go, or what kind of lights you can put on it. And it can often be in conflict with artists. You know, you can have an artist who makes something that is literally falling apart. And a conservator's job is to save that thing, is to think about it as something that needs to be saved in perpetuity. And an artist will turn around to a conservator and say, I don't care. You know, I want people to see it. I don't care if it falls apart. You own it. You paid for it. It's not going to be here in 10 years. It's not going to be here in 50 years. It's not my problem. And those are the kind of conversations we also have with artists a lot, trying to sort of navigate really different priorities and making decisions about that. It's an interesting part of the job, for sure. Shop talk.
Well, I think we'll leave it there, but Catherine
Thank
Morris,
you.
thank you so much.
Thank you.